I am here with Dr. Tim Williamson, professor of logic at Oxford. Thank you so much, Dr. Williamson, for joining us. The first thing I would like to ask you is about ways that we can think about beliefs. So sometimes we'll say that a belief is justified, but what does it mean for a belief to be justified?
Well, one thing I might say to begin with is that when we're talking about beliefs, we're not just talking about religious beliefs like that, or something like that, but also just about very ordinary beliefs, like right now, I believe that there's a computer screen in front of me and so on. And when we're talking about a belief being justified, we're saying that in some sense, it's okay to have that belief. And of course, it might be okay for some people to have it and not for others, because some people have evidence for it and others don't. And I mean, there's a lot of different variation amongst philosophers about how much evidence you need to have in order to be justified in a belief. I mean, that one very low standard is just that what you believe has to be consistent with your evidence. So, I mean, so for example, you know, it's consistent with my evidence that there's life on other planets, even though I don't have any strong evidence for that. But other people have a much higher standard where a belief is justified only if your evidence actually guarantees the truth of it, so that only true beliefs get are justified. That kind of justification is what philosophers sometimes call epistemic justification. It means, you know, it's to do with evidence and knowledge and those kind of things. You can also have beliefs which are justified in a more sort of practical way. So, you know, an example would be, I mean, suppose that someone is facing some quite serious medical intervention, and they read that the chances of it being successful are not great. They're less than 50%, but they are much higher if you believe that it will be successful than if you don't. I mean, maybe even if you believe that it'll be successful, it's still more likely than not to fail, but the chances are much better than if you believe that it will be a failure. And so in a case like that, there's a kind of practical justification for believing it will be a success, because that enhances the chances that it will be a success, even though it's kind of against your evidence, because the evidence suggests that it's still more likely than not to fail. And that's sometimes called a pragmatic justification of belief. But most of the time when philosophers are talking about the justification of belief, they're thinking about these epistemic justifications, which have to do with evidence and that sort of thing.
So when we're talking about the justification for a belief, if we mean an epistemic justification, it has something to do with evidence, but there's other kinds of justification. Okay, so let me ask you more about evidence, which is our justification, or which does justify a belief. Could it be that there is justification for believing that something is true, and equally good justification for believing that that same thing is not true?
There could be. It partly depends on whether it's the same person who has both bits of evidence. I mean, so, you know, so one kind of evidence is evidence from, let's say, eyewitnesses of some crime or something like that. And then you could have two people, you know, one of them, you know, has good evidence that it was let's say the man in the situation who fired the first shot, and because two eyewitnesses said that to them, but then somebody else could have good evidence that it was the woman who fired the first shot, because two witnesses say that to them. And so those are fairly good justifications for believing, but they're for believing opposite things. But they're because that it's different people who have them. If it's the same person at the same time, then then the evidence for and the evidence against would tend to cancel out. Like, if you've been listening to 4 eyewitnesses and two of them told you one thing and 2 of them told you the other, then you don't really have a good justification for believing either. So there is that kind of canceling out with evidence.
Okay, so let's think more about the same person, about the same idea.
Yeah.
I think that's more interesting.
Yes.
So you've given me an example now about testimony. Somebody told me the woman did it, and somebody else told me the man did it, and you're saying they cancel each other out. But what if I was to ask you, do I believe one eyewitness more than the other? Is one more reliable, or was one closer, or is one known to be a liar, or does that change something?
It definitely changes something. I mean, particularly if you've got eyewitnesses with who are known to be liars and others who are known to be very reliable, then they're certainly not equal. I mean, the example I was giving was a very simplified one where I was assuming that all the eyewitnesses were equally good as far as you could tell. But yeah, there are lots and lots of factors which will enhance or degrade the quality of the evidence, and so we're constantly having to balance all those kinds of considerations.
Okay, can you give me an example of a case in which somebody has mixed ideas or mixed feelings because of 2 different sources, not that they have an eyewitness corroborating one story and another eyewitness corroborating the opposite story, but maybe 2 different sources of justification or evidence?
Sure. So here's an example that I've been thinking about recently. So I'm imagining a mathematician who's been working on some problem, and she's worked out a proof of the solution, and this proof, I'm imagining, is in fact, it's quite complicated, but it's in fact totally correct. There are no fallacies or slips or anything in it, and so that's great. But let's assume that she shows her proof to a whole bunch of her senior colleagues who are experts in the field, and they tell her, sorry, your proof is no good. There's a kind of subtle mistake in it, which is a bit difficult to explain, but this is it. And then they kind of talk about what's wrong with it, and she can't quite understand what they're saying. And in fact, there is no mistake. I mean, they might be pranking her, or on a different version of the story, it might be that they're not quite as expert as they like to think, or whatever. But we're imagining that these are people with a good track record, so they're people that she feels she ought to be taking them seriously, and so she's going to be pulled both ways, because on the one hand, she can't see anything wrong with the proof that she's given. It seems to, as we go by all the rules of mathematics. But on the other hand, there are all these experts who are telling her that, look, there's a mistake in it, and we're the ones with the track record, and if you can't understand what the mistake is, that's your problem, and so on. And so that it's a case where it's hard to say simply that the 2 kinds of evidence just cancel each other out, because they're of such different kinds, and each of them in a way is decisive, because the proof itself is actually correct. So that's there in front of her, and there are no mistakes. But on the other hand, someone who just ignores the the advice of a whole lot of experts in an area like mathematics. I mean, they're going to start going off the rails. I mean, it's a very unwise thing to do, not to take other expert mathematicians seriously, and in the long run, that's going to go badly. And so, in a way, a sensible policy is to defer to the expert's opinion. Although in this particular case, the experts are actually wrong, either deliberately wrong or just simply mistaken. And so it's a problem for her. She's going to be pulled both ways. But I think also when we consider it from the outside, we're a bit pulled both ways, because on the one hand, as you say, there's the evidence of the proof itself, which kind of we from the outside know is in fact correct, because that's part of the story. And that in one way seems decisive. And yet on the other hand, there's the evidence of her colleague's testimony. And it seems like it would be a sign of, in a way, a very unwise kind of bad character on her part, not to give weight to what they're saying. And so it's a case where it seems that whatever she does, it's going to be violating, one or other of these sorts of considerations, all of which deserve respect. And even if we say, oh well, then she just ought to suspend opinion or something like that, and be agnostic about it. The trouble with that is that it seems like that's kind of disrespecting the proof that she's got in front of her. I mean, the proof is, if she were to respect that, she would just go with the judgment that, yeah, that's a solution to the problem. So that it's a case where it's kind of hard to know what to say about it.
So you've given, I think, 3 options. One is that she could respect the evidence of the proof itself, and she should, but also she shouldn't. And the second option is, or another option is, she should respect the evidence she gets from her colleagues, and she should, but also she shouldn't. And the third option, or another option, is she could suspend judgment, and then she's not wrong, but she shouldn't do that either, because there's this other evidence. And this sounds to me like she has a serious problem on her hands. It sounds like what some people call a dilemma. Can you help me understand what makes this a dilemma for her mind, an epistemic dilemma?
Yeah, so dilemmas, as philosophers understand them, are situations where whatever you do, you'll be doing something wrong. You'll be violating some kind of obligation or principle or whatever that you shouldn't violate. And so in this situation, if she accepts the proof, she'll be sort of, if you like, violating an obligation to defer to her colleagues' expertise. But if she doesn't accept it, she'll be violating an obligation to respect mathematical proof itself.
So this is something that we might call ambivalence, having contradictory ideas or contradictory evidence. And sometimes I've heard this word ambivalence used as a synonym with cognitive dissonance. But is it the same thing?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, of course, cognitive dissonance is a phrase used by psychologists, but I think, I mean, maybe, I mean, they do use it for some kind of conflict in are assumptions or whatever. So so it is a case where I guess to some extent we're pulled both ways. I'm particularly interested in cases where this is happening to people who are basically very rational, reasonable people. So it's easy to have cognitive dissonance if and actually some kind of ambivalence. If you have crazy ideas that don't match reality. I mean, if for example, if you think that all professors are men, then you're going to have cognitive dissonance and anytime you see a woman professor. But I mean, that's just because you've got this idea in your head, which is just wildly out of key with reality. But in the case of the mathematician that I'm describing, it's not really her fault that she's in this situation. I mean, she's not made a mathematical mistake, but she's and it's quite rational of her to respect her colleagues' opinion as well. And so it's in her case, she's got this ambivalence or cognitive dissonance, because she's a reasonable person and because she's trying to do justice to the different sources of evidence that she has. And so, so these are situations where there isn't really an easy way out because she didn't get into that situation by being irrational or unreasonable.
There's two different kinds of evidence coming at her. There's also two different sources of reliable evidence that she's using. So there's a lot of different things going on, and these are not her fault. But can you start to help us see what she should do?
Well, so I don't think there's some kind of simple answer. Of course, it does partly depend on the circumstances, but I think one kind of distinction which helps a bit, is between what's the right thing to do, on the day, as it were, versus what's a good general kind of policy or strategy or set of habits to have, and those are actually coming into conflict here, because in fact I think the right thing for her to do on the day is just to accept her proof, because it is correct. We put that into the setup of the story, and I think in fact that she can come to know that her solution is correct from that.
I'm surprised that you said that. I thought you would say that as a given policy, she should go with the evidence from her colleagues.
Yes, but I agree but that's the thing. What I was saying then was about what she should do on that particular occasion. But that's in conflict with what's a good habit to be in, to have, and so you can't have it both ways in a situation like that. If you have the kind of habits that it's better to have, then they will sometimes lead you to do things which are not the best things to do on that particular occasion. And if you do what's best on that particular occasion, then it will be because you can do that if you don't have the habits that it's best to have. And so we can answer both questions. We can answer what should she do on that particular occasion, and what kind of habits should she have in general. But the answers are kind of in conflict, and and of course, you could say, well, that should be her habit, but sometimes she should break her habit. But if you're in the habit of breaking your habits, then the habits aren't doing you much good, and so there isn't really a totally happy solution to this, and that's why it's. I mean, the philosophers use the term dilemma. I mean, which started out more in moral philosophy. I mean, there's a famous example which the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre gave of a young man during the Second World War, and on the one hand he's got his old mother to look after, and he feels a duty towards her, and and on the other hand he feels a duty to go and join the resistance, against the occupying Germans. And the point of the example is it's not really that Sartre wants to tell you what this young man should do. The point is that there are two duties there, which are both real, and whatever he does, he's going to violate one of those duties or the other. I mean, we're assuming that there's just no way that he can actually combine looking after his aged mother with being a serious member of the resistance. And so there's, as it were, whatever happens, there's something has gone wrong. But it's not the young man's fault. It's not that he's done something silly to get into this position. I mean, that's life.
So learning something about that and returning to your mathematician example, is the ultimate conclusion here that there is no ultimately correct conclusion for the mathematician to draw?
Well, I think that in a way there are correct, there are the best habits for her to have and the best things for her to do on this particular occasion, and you can't really combine them, and so that's why it's some kind of dilemma. And I mean, the reason that I want to press these cases is that philosophers sometimes, in fact quite often, tend to assume that there must be a sort of pain-free solution to every problem, where once you've worked out what the right thing to do is, you just see that is the correct resolution, and you don't feel that there's anything wrong with doing this thing, and I think that that's simply an oversimplification of life, and that the effect of it is that they may often reject principles which are actually perfectly good, because there's this kind of clash between them and other principles. I mean, it's not exactly a purely logical clash, but it means that they're pulling you in different directions, and if you just, I mean, so the principles may in fact be correct, but there's somehow a difficulty in living both of them at the same time, and and I think that means that, as it were, in situations like that, there isn't a pain-free solution, because there'll be some sense that whatever this mathematician does, for example, that she's disrespecting something that deserves respect, and so as where anything that you suggest about the case can feel like it's objectionable because it's not doing justice to something, and the problem is you can't simultaneously do justice to all these different things. If you do justice to one, you will not do justice to the other, and so I think people, I mean, often what happens is that philosophers, they kind of get put forward more and more complicated theories about what's going on in such cases, because they're looking for a pain-free solution, but they're never actually going to get it. And it's really more sensible just to, as we acknowledge these kinds of practical conflict between different sorts of principle, and then you can actually, I think, keep relatively simple principles, but ones which are in tension with each other in these awkward ways.
My next question was going to be, how could she tip the scales to get a pain-free solution? But that would be ignoring what you just said. Yeah. So paying attention to what you just said, subscribing to the view you just put forth, I want to ask a different question then. Is there something about evidence and justification that we could learn if we take into account what you just said? So the idea that there won't always be one pain-free solution to a problem, bringing that back, what does that teach us about evidence which justifies our beliefs?
Well, I think one lesson to draw is that evidence doesn't always wear its meaning on its face. I mean, evidence is difficult to interpret, and it's always what it seems to be. There can be illusions of evidence. I mean, sometimes you can have evidence when you think you don't, or you think you have evidence that isn't really there, and so on. And I think what people were hoping for was there would be some kind of gold standard of proper evidence, where when you got it, it's just completely clear what it is, and it's clear that you've got it, and when you don't have it, it's clear that you don't have it, and so on. And then we could hope to build up everything from sort of crystal clear evidence at the basis. And I think one lesson is really that that's just a will o' the wisp, but it's just something that we can't really have. That the evidence is kind of messy, like everything else in life. And although we can, in simple situations, it can be relatively clear what the evidence is saying, and so on. That we've got to be able to live with that kind of complexity. I mean, I'm not suggesting that this means that you can interpret the evidence however you like or whatever, because I think that would lead in a kind of horrible anti-scientific direction. And it's not at all that anything goes. It's just that although we're using the evidence that we have as a guide to something else, like the other galaxies or subatomic particles or whatever it is, the evidence itself is something that isn't so easy to know, and so, as it were, there's no level of thinking at which all the confusions vanish and everything is crystal clear, and we somehow have to live with that.
Okay, I have a similar question then about belief. Taking what you said very seriously and just subscribing to it, does that teach us something about belief? Let me specify what I have in mind here. For the most part, I think that the function or the point of a belief, right, is to guide what you do. You want the right belief so you can do the right thing. And you're saying that we should take seriously the idea that we can have misleading evidence, which puts us in a position where there really is no pain-free belief to hold. So what does that tell us about belief?
Well, but yeah, belief is tricky. too. I mean, my own view of belief is that actually the standard is relatively high, that the only good beliefs are ones which are actually knowledge, so that, you know, it's if you believe something false, then there's something wrong with your belief, and strictly speaking, you weren't fully justified in having it. It's only if you it's only, for example, if you know that there's life on other planets, that it's okay to believe that there's life on other planets. So that's quite a demanding view of belief. But yeah, of course, it's difficult to know when you meet that standard for belief. It's difficult because it's often difficult to know whether you know something or not. I mean, it's difficult for this mathematician to know whether she knows that her proof is correct, and so on. So that it's often, whatever standard we set, in fact, for belief, it will often be difficult to know whether we're meeting that standard or not, with our own beliefs, but also to know whether other people are meeting that standard. I mean, the reason that, the standard that I set is difficult to me, it's not, especially because it's a high standard, because, even if you had a relatively low standard, like, all you required of beliefs was that they should be consistent with a person's evidence, it's actually often very difficult to work out whether a given belief is consistent with your evidence or not. I mean, there are even,
especially for your mathematician, she has evidence, she has contradictory evidence, so she would have to have contradictory beliefs if her beliefs were going to be consistent with her evidence.
Yes. Well, I mean, the thing is, if you believe everything that's consistent with your evidence, you'll have contradictory beliefs. If your evidence doesn't decide whether there's life on other planets, it's consistent with your evidence that there is, and it's consistent with your evidence that there isn't. But you better not believe both of those things, because it's not consistent with your evidence that there both is and isn't life on other planets. I mean, it's not, a contradiction isn't consistent with your evidence. And so somebody who has a relatively low standard for belief, being justified like that, they'll be kind of permissive about, they'll say, well, you can believe that there's life on other planets, and you could believe that there's not life on other planets, but you can't do both. Which is not, I mean, so different from, situations where, you're allowed to take the continental breakfast, and you're allowed to take the cooked breakfast, but you're not allowed to take both.
Okay, let's stick with your very high standard of belief, knowledge. Does the mathematician, well, I guess this is a two-part question. I really want to know if, on your view, the mathematician knows anything in this case. And a sub-question to that is, if she has evidence for thinking that the proof is correct through whatever you want to call that, introspection maybe, and she has evidence that the proof is incorrect through testimony of her colleagues. So she has evidence for contradictory beliefs because she has contradictory evidence, and something about belief is inherently attached to knowledge. Does she know either one of those things, on your view?
Yeah, so I wouldn't quite say that the evidence that she gets from the proof is introspective, because introspection is to do with knowing your own states of mind, but she's not really interested in her own states of mind. She's just interested in the mathematics itself. I mean, she might she might be doing it all in her head. I mean, I think it's more normal for mathematicians that they do an awful lot with stuff written on the board or bits of paper or whatever. But even if she's doing it in her head, she's not kind of focusing on, what mental state she's in. She's just focusing on the math. So you can actually spin the story that I told in different ways, partly depending on how complicated the proof is, and how how good a track records her colleagues have, and so on. So there'll be some, there will be cases where the proof isn't that complicated, and where her colleagues aren't that distinguished, and then it would just be, kind of a fairly straightforward that she knows that her proof is correct. And there'll be other cases where the proof is incredibly complicated and her colleagues are incredibly distinguished, and probably in those cases she doesn't know that the proof is correct. So that, there's a kind of spectrum of cases. But there are a whole lot in the middle where there is this kind of ambivalence, because, there is two forms, of evidence which are pulling in different directions, and which both deserve respect. But I think there are certainly circumstances in which she can know, even though her colleagues are telling her that she doesn't.
Is there a circumstance in which she doesn't know, even though she sees the proof?
I think so, because in mathematics, especially modern mathematics, proofs can get incredibly complicated. I mean, they can be 200 pages long or something like that, and that's not 200 pages of just elementary equations. That's 200 pages where almost on every line there's some kind of mathematical inference, which you actually have to be an expert to appreciate. And so, with a lot of those complicated proofs, I think people feel that it's not really established until, the mathematical community, or at least the relevant experts in the area, have had a chance to sort of scrutinize it, and to sniff out where there might be errors, and so on. So it's not that just any old proof kind of guarantees, if it's correct, guarantees you knowledge. It's more complicated than that. But and so so if as I say, if the proof is complicated enough, then she may not be able to know that it's correct, even though it isn't in fact correct.
Making it a very serious epistemic dilemma.
Yes.